the last 6 years to give you an indication of the average annual count of the different species. It takes place in the first week of January each year. I've selected data from the Presqu'île area in the west to the St. Lawrence River in the east, and determined that there were 16 species that are seen every year. And here's the relative abundance. So starting on the left, the Canada goose is the most abundant, and that's 30,000 Canada geese on average counted during the survey. The next most common is the long-tailed duck, which may surprise some people because they're not as easily seen as the Canada goose because they're offshore. Then there are greater and lesser scaup, and these are often difficult to distinguish, so I've lumped the two species together. The common merganser, mallards, and then there's a category called large dabbling ducks, which in survey terms means they're just a little too far away to tell, but because there's no other large dabbling duck except for black ducks, and wherever we can tell the ratio, the mallard to black duck ratio is very high. So I've lumped them in with the mallards. And then redhead, one of the diving ducks, common goldeneye, and then the swans, and then you can see the other species. I won't go through the whole list. But these are the ones seen annually. Moving to those that are uncommon, I'm defining this as being birds that are regularly occurring in the region, and you have a good chance of seeing them if you're out on a regular basis birding in winter. But they're not there every year. And this is from multiple data sources, the Midwinter Survey, but I also checked eBird and a couple of other sources. But there are 9 species that are uncommon, 3 species of geese, the greater white-fronted goose, which is getting to the point where it's almost annual, the snow goose, which is not annual, and tend to be of the subspecies, the greater snow goose, then cackling geese. And then there are one diving duck, one sea duck, the black scoter. Green-winged teal, pintail, and shoveler are all dabbling ducks. And then one diving duck, the canvasback, and the ruddy duck. And then we go to what I have termed rare species, because checking all the sources I could find and relying heavily on eBird, there's only 10 or fewer records in the region that we're talking about in winter. The Ross's goose, the brant, king eider, Barrow's goldeneye. And just a side note here, that Barrow's goldeneye would be easy to miss. There are pretty good flocks of common goldeneye, and common goldeneye is one of those 16 annually occurring species. But they're offshore, they're in large rafts, and Barrow's goldeneye, to be distinguished from common goldeneye, it's quite a difficult thing to do, particularly the females, but the males as well. So they'd be easy to miss, and they may be more common than we give them credit for. The harlequin duck, and the interesting thing about harlequin duck is there's an eastern population and a western population. Basically, the mid-continent lacks harlequin ducks. So the ones we see in the Kingston area would be from the eastern population, which is centered in Labrador. And it's always an interesting question to think about how they might have gotten into the Great Lakes system. Probably up the St. Lawrence, but I wouldn't discount an overland migration from Hudson Bay. Then the tufted duck, which is a European diving duck, very similar to our scaup, and it would be easy to miss, really easy to miss tufted duck amongst the large rafts of scaup that we see. And then the common eider. In terms of abundance and distribution, there are some different patterns and some interesting stories. In general, mallard populations are increasing in eastern North America, and as opposed to black ducks decreasing. And we did a little analysis of this, and it appears to be somehow related to, well, the mallard increase may be related to supplements by the game farm ducks being released, but also a shift in breeding dominance in the boreal and the eastern boreal forest. Diving ducks, and here I'm including scaup in particular, but also the ring-necked ducks redheads and canvasbacks. And there's been a shift in the last few decades to larger numbers overwintering in the Great Lakes, the lower Great Lakes, particularly Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. And this is due to the introduction of zebra mussels. So there's been a fairly large shift and increase in abundance of these birds in winter. In terms of swans, I mentioned that there are 3 species. The tundra swan is a migrant species which nests in the Arctic and particularly in the Western Arctic. It makes a cross-continent migration through the lower Great Lakes, through Ontario, particularly southwestern Ontario, but southeastern Ontario gets its fair share. But they move on to the east coast of the U.S., Maryland, Virginia, for the majority of winter. About 90% of their population winters there. We have, maybe 5% of the population wintering in Ontario. But the 2 species of perhaps greater interest and are clearly more common are the mute swan, which is an unintentional introduction from the late 1800s, but in the last 3 decades has taken off they've gotten established and their growth rate is almost 10% per year. So they're doubling about every 8 years or so in population. And then an intentional introduction was the trumpeter swan. And this was an effort begun in the 1980s to restore what was a native species which used to inhabit portions of Ontario. And it's been a successful reintroduction, but there are still only about 1 trumpeter swan for every 3 to 4 mute swans. And we'd like to see some of us would like to see that going in a different direction. But both of the populations are growing now at 8 to 10% per year. So they might be coming into more competition. Geese, we have one intentional introduction. That was and I'm going to go into this a little bit later, but the giant Canada goose, which was thought to be extinct in the 1950s, but was rediscovered in Manitoba and Minnesota, and following in the 1960s. And then in the 1970s, management agencies across the Midwest and Southern Canada were interested in reintroducing them, which they did. And that was successful in the sense that the populations took hold in the new habitat they found themselves in and have grown in abundance quite a lot. And there's more about that later. There are migrant Canada geese, which have been here for eons, but didn't really stop in southern Ontario except during migration briefly. But because of changes in climate, there's been a long-term northward shift in the latitude of wintering by these migrant subspecies of Canada geese. And then another influence on distribution is the ice cover on the Great Lakes. So in general, there's fewer years of complete ice cover, and that's allowed more habitat to become open on a regular and reliable basis for waterfowl that need water. Now I'm just going to go through some species pictures. I've spoken about some of these, and I'll refer to some of those that I haven't. This is an adult trumpeter swan with a large black bill, relatively wide connection between the eye and the black facial skin, and a nice Roman nose slope. Here's a juvenile trumpeter swan, and they're often called gray swans, whereas the adults are called white swans. You'll see the dusky color on the neck. This is probably a little bit later in winter. That bill changes from that pink bill of the neonate to it'll turn black in about a year and a half. This picture of a couple of tundra swans feeding. I can point out the little yellow patch below the eye on the black facial skin. That's characteristic of the majority of tundra swans. There are some nuances. Rarely a trumpeter swan will have yellow, and more often some of the tundra swans do not have yellow or have a very small patch. So for identification, it can be quite tricky. This is a picture of a winter flock of migrant tundra swans in not from this region. It's a little bit outside the region, along with Canada geese. And then the third swan, the introduced swan, is the from Eurasia. Its center of distribution is in Europe. And this is the mute swan. This is a male with a large black knob on the top of its bill and the bright orange color. I mentioned snow geese. There are two subspecies of snow geese, the lesser snow goose and the greater snow goose. The lesser snow goose is common in northern Ontario in the Hudson and James Bay region and migrates largely to the west of Ontario. But in the Kingston region, particularly as you go east to Cornwall and into Quebec, you have large flocks of greater snow geese in the fall and again in the spring. The person who took this picture is Brian Moran, who lives in your region to the east there. And he told me that we're about 3 or 4 weeks away from the spring migration. So if those of you who live in Kingston, if you haven't made the effort to go see these spectacular migrations, you really should take advantage of the opportunity to see the spectacle. They breed in the north of Baffin Island, basically, and migrate through eastern Ontario in the spring and the fall. It's quite a spectacle, as I said. The majority of greater snow geese are white. It's called the white morph. It's a permanent color condition. It's not a phase that they go through. About fewer than something like 1 to 2% of greater snow geese are blue. And here, this illustrates a blue greater snow goose with a dominant white morph. Whereas in lesser snow geese, it's much closer to 50-50 blue and white. And just for fun, here's a juvenile greater snow goose blue morph. Another goose. So those were the common geese. This is now one of those rare ones in winter. The Ross's goose. They come from what we call the mid-continent population, which the central Arctic and eastern Arctic of Canada is their breeding range. There's only one subspecies. In Ontario, the only confirmed breeding is at Cape Henrietta Maria, which is the tip of the Hudson Bay lowlands where James Bay and Hudson Bay meet. And largely they migrate through the prairies and south to the Gulf of Mexico. And within Ontario, they're sought after by birders. And they're an uncommon migrant. There's no question about that in terms of their status. Moving on to Canada geese, I've mentioned a little bit about them. We have 2 different breeding populations of the subarctic breeding population, which is in the Hudson Bay lowlands of Ontario and the Ungava Peninsula of Quebec. It's a subspecies called the interior subspecies. It's a medium to large goose. When you see them standing next to the largest one, which is the next population, you can distinguish them if they're in flocks, but on an individual basis, it can be difficult to tell one subspecies from the other. They're a native species. Historically, these were the ones, if you're old enough, these were the ones you saw migrating in spring and fall, and they didn't really stay around in southern Ontario in the wintertime. And then the second breeding population is what we call the temperate breeding population. And by temperate, I mean the lower latitude. So southern Ontario, northern US states. And they were reintroduced, as I mentioned, in the 1970s. This just illustrates the 3 forms of what we call white-cheeked geese in generic terms. So the giant Canada goose, the interior Canada goose in the middle there, and this representation of their size is not really to scale. I apologize for that. And then Richardson's cackling goose, which were the cackling goose as a species was just divided from Canada geese in 2004. So it's a relatively recently recognized species, and this is based on genetic divergence about 2 million years ago, and the fact that hybridization between the two, while possible, is quite rare. Canada geese, most of the Canada geese you're seeing in winter in your region are giant Canada geese or temperate breeding Canada geese. Tend to be paler, tend to be larger, but paler in the breast in particular. Like these a really good example of a pale, large geese. Here, I mentioned the two breeding populations, and the first one I'm illustrating is the temperate breeding population. It's the giant subspecies. It was native to Ontario, but it was extirpated and then reintroduced. The place where it was native to Ontario was largely in the southwestern peninsula, where there were some prairies and prairie wetlands. They now have a cross southern Ontario breeding range right up into the boreal and the area around Temiskaming and the Clay Belt. One misnomer that you will sometimes see in the literature, popular literature, is that these are resident Canada geese. I avoid that term because they undergo, half the population undergoes late spring, early winter, or early summer migration to the Arctic to undergo what is called a wing molt. They drop their flight feathers, they become flightless. They're in very remote prairie-like areas of the Arctic and subarctic, where they spend the summer, maybe 60 days, and completely change their tail feathers and wing feathers for a new set of feathers. And then they migrate back south to their breeding areas to winter. So they're migratory. And I don't like to use the word resident for that reason. And you can see their population trajectory since they were reintroduced in the 70s. Getting on to a rare white-cheeked goose, this is the cackling goose, which is largely of one subspecies, the eastern North American tundra nesting cackling goose called Richardson's cackling goose. In the foreground, like a regular Canada goose, I couldn't tell you whether it's a giant or an interior right behind it. Here's a photo of a cackling goose. It's the one in the center here. And then it's two swans, which species I don't know, but here's probably a giant Canada goose there. And you can see the interesting comparison here between the cackling goose and the female mallard. And given, allowing for the difference in the position of the birds, cackling geese are often referred to as more mallard-like in size. Brant is one of those uncommon species. They're reasonably common in the fall and in the spring. Late May, you'll see them in your region. There's a nice overland migration from eastern Lake Ontario to James Bay, and they spend about 5 weeks in James Bay before heading up to the Arctic to breed. And then again in fall, particularly middle-ish of October, you'll see them again. Greater white-fronted geese, fairly recent addition to the regularly occurring goose species in Ontario. And this is because their population grew quite rapidly from the late 90s to the early 2000s, and they have expanded to the east. Now, one nuance here is that some greater white-fronted geese from West Greenland will migrate through eastern North America as a vagrant. So it's kind of a toss-up as to whether the greater white-fronted geese we're seeing in southern Ontario are coming from this expanded western prairie population, or whether they're coming from Greenland. And the nuances of identification would help. I'm not going to go into that, but there's people who will debate every white-fronted goose they see in terms of its origins. Getting back to one of the common species, the mallard, a very, very common species and familiar to most people. Good populations in winter, particularly in urban parks and near shore harbors and such. Here's a nice mixture of the larger dabbling ducks. Mallards with a male pintail in the middle, and female mallard here, but then there's a black duck. And you can tell it's a black duck, not a female mallard, because of the darkness of the plumage and also because of the stripes through the eye. And the yellow bill indicates it's a male, just like the yellow bill of the mallard indicates it's a male. And if you can see the female, she's got an orange bill. So these are little things that are kind of fun to look for when you're out birding. Here's some better pictures of American black ducks. Long-tailed ducks, one of those interesting abundant species, wholly Arctic in their breeding range. They're circum-Arctic, so they're in both hemispheres at the north end. Canada holds a great responsibility for their conservation because of the breadth, or Canadian Arctic encompasses most of their North American breeding range. They're fascinating for a number of reasons. There's a lot of plumage variation. They've got very interesting flock behavior. They've got a wonderful call. The Inuit name for long-tailed duck is a harlick, and I was asked if I'd attempt to imitate the sound. And so during the breeding season, you hear this sound. Now, forgive me for this embarrassing attempt to sound like an old school, but it's a harlick, a harlick, a harlick, a harlick. And the name is onomatopoeic, and it's very interesting. And I should mention, I was going to talk about the brant. Another favorite of mine is actually brant. Probably are my favorite waterfowl of all. I did have an opportunity to study them, and the Inuit name for them is Nuglingnuk. And if you've heard a flock of brant going over, you hear this sound, and it's like a gabbling or garbled chuckling sound. It's very evocative, at least to me. Another common species in the diving duck group is the common goldeneye. Male in the foreground here, a couple of females in the background. One of the tricks here is that they don't mature in the first year like dabbling ducks, like mallards mature, and the young mallard male will look like an adult male in the spring of its, when it's 10, 11 months old. Common goldeneyes don't. So there you can actually look for some interesting patterning in the plumage. And aging ducks is probably one of those underrated identification pursuits. That's quite a lot of fun if you have the time and inclination. Buffleheads, another species, the same thing goes. Distinguishing female buffleheads like the one on the left from a juvenile male in the first year is quite a challenge.
And
the male on the
Ken,
right.
Ken, I'm going to give you a 5-minute reminder.
Yeah,
okay.
I think we're just about done. Yeah,
Sorry.
That's good. Scaup in rafts off the shore, good numbers, interesting plumage. There's a group of greater scaup. And then the ringneck duck. And I should mention that the two species of scaup together, let me go back. It's well shown here. You can see the color, the blue color on the bill. And the vernacular name for scaup is bluebill. And the Kingston Field Naturalists, I think their bulletin is still called the bluebill. Ringneck duck. Here's a not very good picture of a male hooded merganser on the far side of the river, the Otonabee River, where I live in Peterborough. Red-breasted merganser. This is a juvenile male. And then we come to the rarities, which are among the most striking. The harlequin duck, the king eider, and the common eider are all Arctic breeding species. And the Barrel's goldeneye is a boreal, and it's got an eastern population and a western population, like the harlequin duck has an eastern and a western population. as well. So these are the ones that you're not going to see every year, and there are very few records. This is a late winter male. You can see the faces, the facial disc has still got some smudging on it. The flanks are not fully colored. Barrow's Goldeneye, I mentioned how easy it would be to mistake them. So this is a nice close-up picture, very definitive by Gene Iron. And the female Barrow's Goldeneye is on the left here. It's got a largely colored bill, whereas the female common Goldeneye has a pink tip, dark base, and a more brown head, rounded, whereas this is a little more wedge shaped. And here's the male in comparison. These are this bird, this one, and this are all male common Goldeneye. And this one is the Barrow's Goldeneye. And it's called, the subspecies called Islandica for the, I guess, island shape of the, it's a bit of a stretch, but it's a crescent, it's not a round spot. And then king eiders, and I didn't show an adult male. I thought this was a little more interesting. This is a late winter first year male. And this, the illustration of this bird and the harlequin duck both highlight the fact that these molting is going on throughout the year. And it's one of the things you can, if you're out there in the wintertime, you can look for the changes in plumage between the first year birds and the adults. And finishing up with a common eider female, which is another one of the rare species. So, and that concludes the talk. It's a little bit longer than I'd hoped, but
that's all right. That's all right. I had an easy job this time. I haven't seen any questions in the chat, but Ken's offered to answer questions. So if you have a question, maybe put it in the chat or raise your hand, and Roger and I'll try and see you. The chat might be safer. No questions? Barb Lotan wants to know, what is winter?
Well, that's a good definition. A good question. I mean, it could be the calendar winter from December 21st to the equinox. More broadly, in birding terms, it's December 1st to February, or the end of February. So I guess I'm thinking of it as the 3 months of December, January, and February.
We've got another question asking, where's the best place in Kingston for migratory bird observation?
I'm going to boot that question to somebody from Kingston. I mean, I did go to Queens. I was there for 4 years. I did belong to the Kingston Field Naturalists, and Prince Edward Point was great. I'm not sure about winter. We went to other locations. Wolf Island was always worth a visit in winter. I'm going to pass that. Somebody from Kingston want to say
I'll
something?
look for that in the chat. Cliff has asked if it's true that only female mallards quack.
Well, they have different calls. The males and the females have different calls. So what's typically portrayed as the quack is the female call. The male is a little bit buzzier.
When you say that geese mate for life, is that only until one dies and then the survivor finds a new mate?
Yeah, it's a literal description. They will mate for the life of each individual. So
Okay.
they won't always be remating immediately. There's often a delay, but sometimes, depending on the time when the mate dies, there will be immediate repairing. The literature talks about, in particular, spring repairing. So if a bird dies on migration, spring migration, there's an urgency to have a new mate. I've actually witnessed it in the field with snow geese and Canada geese, where one member of the pair died, and it's rapid remating.
I've got a question about black ducks. Do we know anything about why they are declining?
Um, that's a good question. There's a number of hypotheses. One of them has to do with the greater aggression of male mallards for mates. One of them just has to do with the increase in abundance of mallards, which leads in a couple of different ways to potential out competing or out competition by mallards. So in breeding areas like beaver ponds in the on the shield and in the boreal area, if it's there's only so much room, if an aggressive mallard pair gets there ahead of the black duck, that could exclude the black duck from breeding. For a while, there was a hypothesis that there was introgression, genetic introgression, where the male mallard were mating with female black ducks because they were showier and could win a competition for a female. But I'm not sure what the current consensus is. But there's also habitat loss to consider.
Anthony's weighed in on that previous question, Ken. He's suggesting when the river's not frozen, Doug Fleur Park in Kingston is in the afternoon is great for waterfowl.
Okay, thank you, Anthony.
George has asked, I've heard a large flock of long-tailed ducks vocalizing together loudly, then falling silent altogether all at once. How do they know how to do this?
How do they know how to vocalize together? Is that the question? It's probably contagious. It depends on the context, I'm sure, about why are they vocalizing. If they're vocalizing to indicate their intention to fly, that would be a reason for all of them doing it together. I know that I lived in Moosonee for 5 years, and in the first week of November, we would hear highly vocal flocks of long-tailed ducks flying over at night, and they were probably vocalizing together to indicate their presence and to keep contact. So that's a guess anyway.
I've got a question about hooded mergansers. Are hooded mergansers in the Kingston area?
Yeah, they are, and I think they breed on the Shield and probably the northern portion of the St. Lawrence Plain as well. But they are they're not that common in winter, but they are there.
Judith has asked, there was a barnyard goose with the Canada geese along the lake this summer and fall. Would the barnyard goose be able to survive with the flock?
It's possible. Some barnyard geese are capable of sustained flight, and when we're banding Canada geese in northern Ontario and James Bay and Hudson Bay, we do sometimes find a barnyard goose which has made that migration. So it's possible. And there have been many cases of interbreeding between Canada geese and domestic barnyard geese. And you see one of my favorite things to do is look for hybrids between domestic gray leg type domestic geese of the gray leg lineage with Canada geese. So they're reasonably obvious.
I've got one more question. Elizabeth is asking about where do the waterfowl spend overnight?
Depends on the species. Most like all the diving ducks will spend the evenings in rafts on the water. They'll tuck their heads under their wings and they'll float closer together, and that's where they spend the overnight. Geese probably do it closer to shore, and just above the waterline, maybe in more terrestrial areas. But what else? So I think there's a difference based on the habitat. Mallards would be similar to the geese, close to shore, in the shallows, often not in the water, not standing. So geese and mallards probably standing on shore, huddled in groups.
Okay, I think we have time for a couple more questions, and then we'll move on to the photo sharing. Annette has asked whether ice cover is important or a threat to wintering waterfowl.
Well, the more ice cover there is, the less open space for diving and such. I think it would have to be an extreme situation to be considered a threat. I think it's more like the relationship. If the inshore areas are solid ice, that is going to exclude a lot of wintering waterfowl from finding the food that they need. So I think they would have to move off. Not a threat in the sense that the ice causes them harm, but a threat in the sense that extensive ice cover in the nearshore areas is going to exclude them from finding food, and they'll leave the area.
Right. All right, and last we have a breeding pair of mute swans on our lake. Is anything being done to control their populations?
Well, that's a right question. So they're protected under the Migratory Bird Act as a swan, but they're considered invasive, and they can be eliminated with permit. The Canadian Wildlife Service will issue permits to landowners who feel that or can provide evidence that the mute swans are damaging local areas and such. I'm a little uncomfortable going down that road, but there are programs where mute swans are common, where there's egg oiling to prevent successful reproduction. In Ontario, there's no removal program that I'm aware of, but I'm a little uncomfortable there. Haven't kept real good track of the regulations.